Where were you born?
I was born in Kiev, Ukraine, but at the time of my birth, it was still the USSR. So when my family left the Soviet Union, I would still identify as being from Russia, right? And from the Soviet Union. And I don't speak in Ukrainian, because Ukrainian was taught as a foreign language. And the first time I actually saw that I was born in Ukraine, identified that way, was my American passport. It was the very first time because all my exit documents still listed USSR. And it wasn't until it became a country that it was later listed as place of birth. So that's actually a kind of a
Wow.
loaded question for me.
How old were you when you moved to the US?
I was 9.
At your time in Ukraine and where you grew up, did you live with your mom and dad? Kind of what was your home life like in those early years?
So, although for many families, when many couples got married, they lived with their parents because there weren't really enough housing. My parents had gotten an apartment right before I was born. So it was my parents, me, and my older sister, and what would be in the States a two-bedroom apartment.
Are you the youngest?
I am. There's just the two of us.
How old was your mom when you were born?
My mom was 32 when she had me, and 26 when she had my sister.
What was school like for you, 9 and younger?
So I was always an excellent student, but I have very little memories of kind of my pre-US schooling. I think because the immigration process was very tumultuous, it was also a lengthy process. I got pulled out of school because it was very slightly less strong than dangerous, but dangerous to announce because we were leaving as Jews, as refugees. You didn't go around announcing that you were leaving. So as soon as my parents filed paperwork, I was pulled from school. So only went to about probably 2 months of third grade before getting pulled. There is kind of a story around this immigration wave that was the Russian Jews coming to America at that time. You could only be granted an exit visa to Israel. So you could only leave because you were going, homeland. And then people left, then you went to Austria and then Italy, and where they redid your paperwork for wherever was the actual country of your destination, which could have been Israel, could have been Canada, it could have been US, could have been Australia. It was wherever there was family. So you were doing family reunification and coming in as refugees. But that process took, for us, relatively short. It was from November to March, so that's 4 months. But there's been people who, this process was 8 months or 9 months. My maternal grandparents left before us, and at that time, we wouldn't know if we actually would see them again, what would happen, how things would go. My paternal grandparents were with us, as well as my father's brother and his family. So we were a family of 10. So in Austria, we were for 5 weeks and there wasn't really any schooling then. But when we were in Italy, because it was unknown how long we would be there, we were 2.5 months. So they had a school set up for the kids who were going through the process by the organizations who were kind of supporting us. So I did some schooling there. Again, like I remember being in school and coming to my parents with like a long division problem. And again, as an excellent student, always like if I was assigned homework, I did homework. Well, that's what you do. And I remember going to my parents, and my parents were like, "Are we really doing this right now? Like we have other problems to tackle." School for me was always relatively easy. Always a high achiever, and kind of it was always very important in the family. Definitely a focus on education. My other kind of immigrant story for education is first day of fourth grade was when I started, and we came to Brooklyn, and it was a relatively large Russian speaking community. Not a whole lot of like recent immigrants at that time, for at least for my school. And it was June, and my parents wanted me to start at the end of the grade so I can get accustomed. So when I start a full new year, I wouldn't be like struggling as much. So I walk in, and my teacher was older, probably like an older man, and I didn't understand a word of English. And he spent the entire time screaming. I was traumatized. I was like, my parents picked me up from school. I was like, I'm not going back there. I don't know. He's screaming at me. I'm doing something wrong. I don't understand what I'm doing. My parents bought me my first ice cream off the ice cream truck, which was an enormous amount of money for us at that point. But I was like that distressed. My dad, who didn't speak English either, but he spoke Yiddish, and my teacher spoke Yiddish, so he came to school with me the next day to understand what was happening. And the teacher was like, "I'm old. I hear poorly. They're loud." So I'm just really loud. I agreed to go back to school, and it was okay. But it was like still, clearly this many years later, it really stands out,
Wow.
or one of those moments where you're so lost and you have no way of kind of contextualizing what is going on for you. And like you were taken from a world in which you knew everything everything to
Yeah.
where you completely are at a loss. And like, kids aren't necessarily kind. So I'm sure that some, girl who also has progression was sitting next to me could have explained to me what was happening, but they didn't. That was hard. It got better. I made it all the way through school.
More of perspective in that. And, that teacher, there was no way for him to understand the situation that you were in and how raw it was for you. You don't
And
know what
it's
the other person has gone through.
And it's always like it's interesting because you kind of talk to other immigrants from doesn't matter where you're from, but it's all of these kind of small misconceptions and misunderstanding that like have life impact. So when we started school, my parents got asked what grade I finished, but they misunderstood and said what grade I started. So they said third.
Did your parents speak English? Did your mom or
Nope.
really? Did you and your sister?
Nope. So kids pick up language faster. So by the end of fifth grade, I was probably speaking, maybe not fluently, but sufficiently. My sister maybe a little bit longer. She speaks with more of an accent. Apparently, accents are muscle control. So you have no accent if you come before the age of 6. You have a full accent if you come after 12 because your vocal cords are soiled. And if you come between 6 and 12, you kind of sound like me, where you can sometimes hear it and you sometimes can't.
What did that feel like to you when you came to the US?
Really? And I was a shy kid. I'm much more kind of outgoing now. It happened, I guess, somewhere in high school. But I was a relatively shy kid, so I didn't have, I think, a need for a whole lot of friends. But I had a best friend midway through fifth grade. I remember asking to, because I'd just gotten a Nintendo, like the very first one, and I knew she had a Super Mario Brothers 3 game, and I really wanted it, and I knew I couldn't afford to buy one. So I needed to figure out how to borrow one. And I remember asking her to borrow it. And then we were friends for like years after that. Again, there was enough Russian speaking kids in school. So language wasn't as much a barrier, and because it was like city living, driving was less of an issue. And I definitely had friends, maybe not fourth grade, but I would say fifth grade and on. So no, not a whole lot of time alone. And my sister's a social butterfly and always was. And she's 6 years older, but she made friends easily and she kind of didn't really mind having me around, which I think was very kind
Good.
of her.
Yeah.
And was very, she was definitely like an extra parent, very adult. And that's very common for in the immigrant community, right? Where the oldest child takes on a lot of the
Right.
responsibilities because language comes easier. Like she would, if I had to go to an appointment or something, that's who would always be there. So, and even as far as like when I was ready to apply to college, because she had already done that and she was in a lot of ways kind of my guide.
What did your sister end up doing for work, or what was her areas of interest earlier on in her life?
Oh, so I wish I would have prepared this one better. So she has a very cool title that I'm going to screw up again. I'm going to regret it. She is the International Director of AI for Salesforce. Like she's got
Oh
a
my
really cool title.
gosh.
She went to Pace University right out of high school and got her degree in business management and then did that kind of work along the way. Had 2 kids, got her master's in the process of having her 2 kids. Always worked. And now that she had kids really early, because she was always an adult. So she had a kid at like 22, which I could not
Yeah.
conceptualize, like at 22 and 27.
Yeah.
So, early by her mid 40s, she was an empty nester. So, and really kind of invested in her career at that point.
I wonder how she feels about, did she have a childhood and how quickly that ended for her. And I mean, she had you, and I'm sure you were a great kid. And so it wasn't, worst case scenario of like raising 4 kids when you're still a kid. But still you develop quicker and you don't
Yeah.
really go through that childhood. You like skip a lot of phases in there.
For her, but more teenagers. She would have been 14.
Okay.
So it would have been kind of be getting much older at 14. So yeah, it wasn't so much parenting, like, we still certainly had
Right.
active parents, but it was the guidance. And, if I had a question or if I wasn't sure like what direction to take, that would have been kind of who I went to. Although then I decided to major in psychology and messed with everybody's understanding of what people do in school. And that was the end of guidance because they were like, what are you going to do? So you're going to go to school and do what?
Do you remember growing up differences between boys and girls at a young age?
So that's actually probably not so much. All my best friends from very large portion of my life were, I had a lot of male friends. That friend I made in fifth grade was my first female friend, actually. I grew up kind of a tomboy, and really always felt like it was important to have male friends, and still to this day have a lot of male friends. I think it kind of rounds out kind of your experience because it's a very different kind of point of view. I remember when I was getting married and like I'd be freaking out and all my girlfriends are freaking out with me. And then I'd call like my male friend who was like, "You want me to talk about what with you? You
Yeah.
want you want to talk about why your flowers look wrong? I don't think we're going to worry about that right now." So I kind of always appreciated having that perspective. I don't think I really encountered much from my parents of things that they felt like I couldn't do because I was a girl. My mom always worked and was always very independent and very kind of like go-getter, like driving force of the family. And I'm thinking back, one of my grandmothers didn't work, one of my grandmothers did work. So again, it wasn't unusual for me to see kind of strong women.
What did your mom do for work? Both of your parents, what they do for work?
So when they came here, right, you
Right.
kind of have to restart everything. So my
Yeah.
mother was started as a teacher in a daycare and then was a director of a daycare at the Salvation Army before she retired. And my dad worked maintenance at the Central Park Zoo. And then in Russia, they both had engineering degrees, but that's what everybody had. So
What did they both work as engineers before?
there it was complicated because your degree didn't really pertain to what you did
Gotcha.
in merely that kind of direct relationship. It's like mandatory workforce and you got whatever job you were assigned to do.
Do you remember, and I'll stop going back after this, but why they left as a kid? Were you very aware of why they were leaving?
So yes and no, and it's hard in some ways to answer because I don't know what I actually remember and what I remember from kind of family
Right.
lore that I've heard. But there was a lot of anti-Semitism in these years, then blatant. And like I remember like my sister walking me home from school and being like accosted by some neo-Nazis.
Um,
So like blatant.
yeah,
And I knew we were leaving because of that. How much I knew then, again, you didn't disclose, like you wanted kids talking about it as little as possible. Like you didn't go around
right.
telling your kids they were Jewish. I didn't find out. Well, again, I know this story as family lore. I don't know when I actually found this story, but my sister had started first grade when I was born, and she had found out she was Jewish from other kids making fun of her at school. And um, when she came home and she asked her parents if, they were Jewish, they said yes. And then said, "Am I Jewish?" Said yes. She's like, "Is the baby Jewish?" And she said, "Yeah." And my mom said yes. And she was like, "Well, what did she do to deserve that?" This is, early 80s. We left in 89. And then it has become, so it's always been really important for all of us to kind of maintain our Jewish identity, although I identify culturally Jewish rather than religiously so. But
Right.
kind of that's been a really important part of my identity because it was something that was like almost denied early, right? You couldn't
Yeah.
celebrate holidays, you couldn't do, right? Like that's not something you did if you wanted to be okay and safe.
You didn't grow up with clearly defined role. Your mom and dad, they worked together to raise you, it sounds like. Was your dad very approachable and you could talk to him about things and was he present?
He was present and approachable. I don't know how much approaching I necessarily did. He was definitely, home for dinner, right? Like they didn't have the kind of jobs that required long
Yeah,
hours or anything. And he was certainly around always, but I don't know that the kind of things I would want to talk about that he was necessarily equipped to talk about, especially kind of
sure.
given the state of the world. And again, if I started like with my sister and then my mother, and then, by the time it came to him, chances are someone along the way might have answered my question. But he was certainly, always around for comfort. And, I'm still very close to him to this day.
Did your mom cook?
And does still till this day.
Did she put
It
pressure
really
on
is love.
you to help? Like, was that important for you to know how to cook and to be home to help with that? Or,
So I'm like full of fun stories, and I'm a funny cooking story. I did not cook at home. My mother cooked enough, and her belief was, when you're on your own, you're going to do plenty of this. There's no reason for you to be doing
Mhm.
this right now. Go focus on, education, have a job. So, and then psychology major at NYU was only 9 credit, like 9 classes. So I got that done pretty quickly. And then I was a sociology minor. Okay, we got that done. And then I needed to do something else with another year of school. So I told my mom I was going to take cooking classes. And she said, well, how much are cooking classes? And I was like, well, I don't know, 4 credits at $1,000 a credit, a $4,000 credit cooking class.
I
And
bet
she's
she
like,
was just baffled by
she's
this.
like, yeah, I don't think we're going to do that. And I said, so what do you think I should do? And she said, you should take a literature class. And I was like, wait, I at least don't know how to cook. I certainly already know how to read. What am I going to do in a literature class?
She worked so hard for you to focus on your education, and then you go to school and learn how to cook.
So yeah, I ended up being a computer applications minor and almost didn't get into grad school because I should never have had a minor in computer applications. That I should have taken a cooking class. Was the answer to that story was that would have been a much better choice.
Right, right. How
But yeah,
funny.
I didn't start cooking really until I moved out and moved in with my husband. And even
Yeah.
like then, I remember like calling her and be like asking for a recipe or something. She'd be like, "Do you want me to just make it for you? Like, well, wouldn't it just be easier if I did it?" And some of that is control because she told me she was going to teach me to cook and then told me that she redid her kitchen and get out. So but for her, I think it was always kind of almost like a protective thing. Like if I am putting in the time and the energy to do this, why are you spending your time doing something I can help you with? Right? Like your time is precious. Do something I can't help you with your time.
Do you think she didn't want you to end up having to? I mean, she worked, but I don't know if she really got to live out her full life and do everything that she wanted to do. It doesn't sound like your home was, against that or that your dad would have been really upset about it. She might have put those expectations on herself. But it seems like she was adamant about you not being forced into that role of having to cook every night and making sure that you had other opportunities.
No, because she definitely saw kind of managing a house as something I was going to do. I just think it was more like a postponement of,
Yeah.
there'll be time and space for that. But I think that her having limited opportunities had more to do with having come here, in her 40s and having to start
Yeah.
from scratch rather than, any constraints that kind of home life put on her. Like they certainly
Right.
now that they're retired and have settled down, get to live out whatever it is they want, they get to travel and they get to kind of do the things that they had worked so long and hard for and the opportunities they created for themselves. And yet she still cooks a whole lot. But I can tell you they live relatively close, and that was kind of the by design. If I called right now and told my mother my son happens to be sick right now, as of today, that before running here, I was making soup and said her first answer was, why didn't you call me? I would have made it like for you. There's definitely this element of let me help you with the things I can because there may not
Yeah.
be as many things as I can help you with.
Yeah.
Her love language is definitely acts of service. So wherever she can act of service, she certainly does.
When did you start thinking about psychology?
Remarkably early. I find humans fascinating. And also I think some of it, and this is also kind of maybe a retrospect thought, but because I was kind of in the immigration world, like some people really did well and some people really succeeded and some people were crushed by it, even though circumstances on the surface might have looked very similar. So I was really interested in coping. I was really interested in how people think and why in a particular situation somebody acts one way or not another. So I was by like middle of high school, I knew I wanted to do psychology. So I was taking psychology classes my junior and senior year in high school. I took AP Psych in high school and then did undergrad psych. I knew I was going to get a doctorate. Like I knew that was going to be my path. So I spent all of college getting into grad school because admission rates were, 2 to 12% back then even. So most of my college was geared towards getting into grad school.
College was always, just education in general was important to you, right?
To me, to my family, definitely always. For my sister has never forgiven me for not having applied to Harvard. I was never going to get into Harvard, but it was like important for her that like it was kind of that mark of, like almost like educational status. So yeah, I didn't apply. Then neither did her kids. And so
So she's forever mad. Maybe grandkids. Maybe
grandkids, or
grandkids
I
will
still
go.
have kids who are not of college age yet. So
Yeah.
she still has holding out hopes, but I think we've managed those.
Does she have a bit of your mom's personality on like, let's do this and let me handle this?
I think everybody in my family has a little bit of that personality. Definitely a whole lot of people who are very into kind of controlling circumstances and
Strong.
being
Yeah.
the best of things. But also, I think there's a lot of like humor and like banter. So it's not like, it doesn't feel stiff, but it
Yeah.
certainly feels goal oriented, right?
Yep.
Like, but I also come from a culture where feelings weren't quite like a thing. So again, when I was going to major in psychology, they were like, "You're going to talk about what?
Why? Yeah.
Why?" It's literally. I remember once asking, I was doing a workshop during COVID in Russian. I was asked to do, and I couldn't because my training's in English. My Russian's proficient, but I couldn't come up with like a feel for a phrase. So I asked my mother how you would translate. How does that make you feel? And she thought about it. She was like, "Why would anyone care?" And it was like,
That
oh.
describes it. Yeah.
Yeah, but that is the essence of the culture, right?
Yeah.
And that was what was instilled in them forever. So yeah, feelings are not that they weren't encouraged, but much more cognitively heavy than feelings heavy. And it's interesting
Right.
because I'm not a cognitive behavioral therapist because my mind works like that. That orientation of therapy made sense for me because that's how my mind works.
Do you remember always wanting to have children, or what were your thoughts about having a family as you were growing up?
I always wanted to have children, and because my sister had kids really early, my niece was born when I was 16, and they lived close, and that was like my baby, and I spent an enormous amount of time with her. Part of my decision to not go away to college was because I was a senior, was that I wanted to be kind of close by. I wanted to see her grow up, and then they moved to New Jersey and kind of messed with my plan because I was in New York. But I spent a lot of time with her. So family was always really important. And I knew I wanted to have a family.
What about finding a husband? And some families talk more about this than others, but did you have a game plan? Did you put time into it? Did you, focus on finding the right partner?
So we met, I was in my second year of grad school. I didn't really have time to be putting in a whole lot of effort into a whole lot of things. I generally knew that I wanted a partner who was ambitious as well and who would support me in my ambitions, but also kind of wanted to fun and adventures and kind of have a full life. Me and my husband met camping. So, and that's relatively easy to show up to your first date after that, having showered and you're like, yeah, I got this.
What does your husband do?
He is, oh, this is one of those, so the business people in my life, I get
It's
their,
just made up titles. I can tell you that.
I
It's
know.
literally,
If I'm again, this is going to be one more screw up. He's the VP of customer success at iPipeline. That one is probably closer to what it actually is than when I did my sister's.
and so was he in studying business, I'm assuming, in college?
So he did business in college. He went, so it was interesting. I went to NYU. I wanted like the big school and being in the city, and
Mhm.
he went to Dickinson, which is in nowhere, Pennsylvania. Loved his school. I did not like NYU, so it was actually a really interesting kind of like where there's a place for everyone, and how do you really know how to find that match? He did international business, and has a master's in, I'm going to say international business as well. He got his master's while he was studying abroad in Germany. So he got his master's
Mhm.
before he got his undergrad. But he was done with school by the time we met, and he was working as a consultant. So he traveled a lot when we met. And then I was in school. And then when we were getting married. So last year of my doctorate was is an internship And we only had like 10 days PTO, and I had to defend, get married, go on a honeymoon, and find a job. And it was like, I don't think 10 days are going to cut it. So I remember showing up to work like half sick, and they were like, "Why?" I was in a hospital. They were like, "Why are you here?" I was like, "Because I've got my 10 days accounted for, people. So either give me more time or here you go."
That's a lot to fit in. Did it cross your mind about postponing getting married?
So we had been together at that point for going on 5 years, and I knew it wasn't going to necessarily get any better. So I had one
Sure.
summer between school and like my start of my internship, and it was like the only time I didn't have anything. So I said I was going to go ahead and plan our wedding, and if we had time to get engaged beforehand, great. If not, I'm just going to go ahead with like my schedule, and he can catch up as he sees fit. So I did that because I had the time. And I, as a, a planner, I had a plan, right? I was going
Mhm.
to get married, and then I was going to, so you need a year of work post your degree for licensure to make it to have enough hours for licensure. So I was going to get pregnant. I was going to get married. I was going to get pregnant. I was going to use that pregnancy year to get my hours, take my licensing exam, and then I was going to have be done and have my baby. And then so for somehow the life just didn't like know I had a plan. So it didn't work out exactly like that. But to kind of to answer your question more fully about why I didn't wait, I was 27 when I was finishing, and even though I went like straight, I went from college straight into grad school. All of my friends were already married. Lots of my friends were already having kids. It was a really, those last 2 years of school were really hard for me, like emotionally, because it felt like I was emotionally ready for the next stage of my life, but I still had a lot of homework to do. So it was very, for me, it was very disjointed. So I was definitely ready to not postpone this any further. But I also knew I couldn't manage like having a kid in grad school. So I
Right,
knew I needed to be done. Plus, the last year of the internship is a match, just like for med school. So I didn't even know where I would potentially end up.
right.
So, I wouldn't want to be away from my resources. And
It wasn't in your case a lot of people putting pressure on you and society putting pressure on you. It probably just reminded you of how much you wanted a family and that you really wanted to have that role and start, that process of building a great family. And you were just being reminded of it every time your friends would talk about getting married and having kids and what they were doing. Something I've noticed, just you talking about your life and your family, and you had friends that you seemed to make pretty easily. You were surrounded by good people, great people, for most of your life. And there are unfortunately quite a few individuals who aren't. And when you're not, you struggle to kind of build that network from scratch, right? Like if you didn't come from a great family and you're an adult, you can build your own life and you're trying to do that. What would you say to someone who's, how do I determine if someone's a good person? I know that's a loaded question.
so it's actually interesting. I have this conversation all the time because I have a 14-year-old girl. So who you surround yourself with is a conversation that we have frequently. And it's funny, she said to my husband and I at some point, she's like, "You have so many smart friends. How did that happen?" I was like, "It is not an accident. It's not like we randomly, talk to people and they just happen to be smart. No, we're pretty selective about who we devote our time to." So I think kind of the lesson one, and this is very hard, especially for teenagers, is quality over quantity. I am not trying to fill my social calendar. I'm trying to spend my time in a way that's fulfilling and interesting to me. And for me, it was always looking for people who I find interesting. And granted, I find most people interesting, so that's a relatively low bar. But somebody who can like contribute something, someone I can have a conversation with that I can't have with somebody else. And that could be because they're either in a world that's completely foreign to me, or because they have a different perspective on things, or because they'll call me out on, kind of my stuff that probably needs to be rethought. I also find that if you have to work really hard for a friendship, it probably doesn't need to be, right? Like two people need to be putting in the effort. And granted, all friendships require work, all relationships in general require work and time and energy, but it can't be one-sided.
Yeah.
And that is hard, like something we try to instill in her. That's kind of hard for ninth grader to accept, right? Because there's that group, and you feel like if I just make it into that group, if I invest everything and I make it in, then life will be wonderful. And then you either make it in and it's not as wonderful as you thought, or you don't make it in and now you're permanently feeling like not enough, versus that probably wasn't really your world anyway, because if it doesn't want you, it isn't your world. When I work with clients on like building their social networks, what I usually tell them is like, let's figure out what you're interested in, go do
Yeah.
that, and that will be the place where there's other people who find that thing interesting. And now you don't have to generate a common ground. You came in
Right.
on common ground. And that is often easier. I also find activities are easier for people to connect around than talking. And this is interesting because men and especially boys naturally do this. Almost for women, especially teaching that part, like, no, you can go and do I don't know, a crafting class or
Right.
a bicycle riding class or whatever it is that you hiking that you find interesting, and go and just do it. And then you can talk to the people there about the thing you're doing.
I want to talk about you made a comment that you take criticism well and you feel like that's helped you. And you talked about your family and it's not talking about feelings, but maybe making fun of things, laughing, joking. How could you help someone else bring that into their life? I feel like we've lost humor a little bit
Mhm.
over time, and especially as just the cost of living has gotten so high that everyone has to have a good education, everyone has to have the big job with those crazy titles that you've mentioned. And we're kind of losing a sense of humor and
Mhm.
we're getting really sensitive. Not that it's okay to be mean to people or any of that, but that's not really what we're talking about. We're
Mhm.
talking about someone who genuinely cares about you that says, hey, there might be have you tried this? Or there might be a more efficient way to do that. And just being able to have those discussions is sometimes easier when you have a little bit of a sense of humor.
Again, these are one of those things that like every coin has a positive and a not so positive. So a lot of the like accept yourself culture has almost gotten in the way of this, because we somehow took accept yourself to mean don't work on self-improvement, which is not true. That's not what accept yourself means. Accept yourself means figure out where your strengths are and build on those, not accept where your strengths are and sit on the couch, right? So I think it's hard for people to take criticism sometimes because they see it, well, then you're not accepting me. Well, no, I just expect better of you, right? I know there's more in you. So I think that's one. I think humor is kind of got to know your audience, and humor often lightens a difficult moment if done appropriately. And again, I think this idea of kind of in psychological radical acceptance, where I think you're a worthwhile human no matter what happens or what you do or whatever. I may not be kind of thrilled with what you did or how you decided or the choices you made, but that still doesn't undermine you being a worthwhile human. And if you can believe that I believe that, then if I am kind of picking on you a little bit, it becomes easier to tolerate. And then in reverse, if you think of yourself as a worthwhile human, right, then if somebody is kind of joking around with you, it doesn't destroy your inner self, because I'm not
Right.
basing my understanding of myself on what you think of me. I'm basing my inner sense of self based on what I think of me. And if you happen to not like that, well, I can probably learn to live with that.
That kind of comes back to making friends based off of, someone that actually adds value to your life and you enjoy spending time with versus someone that maybe makes you feel important.
But also one of my pet peeves is when couples come in. I do couples therapy as well. And when people come in and we're like, we are so close, we're one. No, you're not. You're two. Two people make two people. They do not ever make one. May be two people who are the best they can be because of each other, but they're still
Mhm.
two people. And I think that that is important to remember, that you don't need someone to complete you. If you're coming into something being less than one, then that is where problems are going to start. When I treat couples, I say there's like almost like three things we're treating in the room. There's the
Yep.
two people and the relationship. Those are
Right.
three separate entities that may need to be addressed, and relationships are dynamic. So as one person changes, the other person changes in response,
Uh,
right? So it is a separate entity.
you grew up in an extremely unique situation. And thankfully, it seems like you, for the most part, had great parents and a family unit and were surrounded by people that helped you through all of that. When you look at your children who grew up in a completely different environment, I almost feel like you're more comfortable with who you are than maybe your children might be. And that's so strange when you think about, oh, well, maybe my life was more difficult or I went through so much change. How could I be more comfortable in my skin and with who I am than my children?
So the comfort in your own skin, I think, is a perspective problem, right? We're not seeing ourselves as our 14-year-old self. My 14-year-old self was pretty unhappy in her own skin as well. The advantage of being this many years later is
Right.
the advantage. And it's funny, because of kind of when we came and where, I never learned to ride a bike because it would have been right around that same time when that should have
Uh,
happened. So I didn't learn to ride a bike until COVID when we were suddenly home and my husband was teaching my then 5-year-old and me to ride. And my daughter had like a medium-sized bike. She was 10 at the time, and I had an adult bike and it kept falling off of it and hurt a lot. So I was like, right, we're going to trade bikes. I'm going to take the medium-sized bike and learn on that. And my little one was like, Mommy, you look silly like on a baby bike. And I was like, yeah, my mommy's self-esteem is okay, but the falling off the bike hurts, right? Being in my 40s, I'd be like, okay, I fell off a bike. I can be okay with that. I will sit on a lower bike and be okay. Versus, I don't think, me at 14 could have done that. So I think some of it is also perspective, and every generation in retrospect thinks that they're, somehow extra different. I was just having this
sure.
conversation actually with my dad, and I was talking to him exactly about what he said, like, can't believe like what my childhood was like versus like these kids who just don't understand anything. He was like, are you talking to me? My dad was born in 1947 in Ukraine, 2 years after the end of World War II, in a devastated country. He was like, really? We're going to compare childhoods now? If you talk about difference, my childhood to his childhood was even
Uh,
greater difference than my childhood to my kids' childhoods. So it's, to your point about it's all perspective. But that's kind of the long answer. The more specific answer about the kind of stuff I do worry about, the constant need to know everything about everyone at all times, right?
mm,
Like the active Snapchat maps, like, the tracking of where everybody is and needing to know where they are and then feeling left out because you're not with them. And like you realize we
yeah,
live in a world where you did not know where your friends were at any given
yeah,
time. And the only way you knew that is they chose to share that information with you.
right.
And I think they're very uncomfortable with uncertainty and with not immediate knowing, which is not a skill that they've had to build. Think about like having to come home and find out if somebody called you or not, right? If you were waiting for a phone call, you were going to have to wait several hours to find out if
Yeah,
somebody actually called or not. That is not an experience they've had,
right,
right? And it's more than just patience. It's this idea that things aren't immediately available, right? It's delayed gratification.
right.
Delayed gratification happens to be the best predictor of academic success. I think they're missing a lot of that. I think they don't have a whole lot of opportunities for delayed gratification.
And I like your perspective, it's kind of saying, and scientifically, sure, over really long periods of time, humans do change. But for the most part, in our time frame that we're talking about, humans are humans. And, how we feel about things and how we act and our behaviors, they're going to be affected by what's around us, but it doesn't change who we are and how we think.
And it's even more than that, because if you think about like our actual physiology is caveman physiology.
Yeah.
You know, we respond, our fight or flight is based on what was adaptive to cave people, right? Our interaction with food is what was adaptive to cave people, right? So we talk about a generation or two, but if you think about the way you react to, I don't know, public speaking is really the way your ancestors responded to lions, and it developed based on that, right? Because your body
Right.
can't tell the difference between what's evoking the fear. We as a species are much slower to change than we like to acknowledge.
Let's talk about your career. You were pretty sure about what you were going to do early on. But in terms of advice on figuring out what you want to do and what colleges to go to, you still had to pick a college. As a young person, go in that stage, it does have a significant impact on your life where you go to college. How does one go about even, is there a way to make that decision and what things should they consider?
So it's interesting because now, as having a freshman in high school, and because all my friends had kids earlier, as I had mentioned before, like a lot of them are going through like their kids picking colleges. My experience was so vastly different because again, I had so much more limited information, and most of my friends stayed local. And there was obviously a financial constraint to a lot of college decision, not really understanding the way kind of the system works. So I'm not sure that my own experience is prepares me as well for that advice as, kind of future career. I used to be a college counselor, so that potentially prepares me more for knowing what that world is. But I would say find your place. And so find your place, and if you know what you want to do long term, then like think about it. Like for example, I knew I wanted to go to grad school. So the one thing I did know I needed to be was at a research institution because I knew that grad schools were going to look at 4 years of research and I needed to be at a place where I could do that easily. If you're going to be, at a place that if you're looking to continue your education, what does that next step look like? And what is going to position you best for that step? If you're going to be in an industry that is particularly concentrated somewhere, does it make sense to be in that place of the world, right? If you're going to do, I don't know, politics, is really a rural, kind of small school really the place for you? Are you
Right.
going to have the opportunities to meet the kind of people you need to meet? So for me, it's that. It's kind of thinking what the next step looks like and how do you best position yourself for the next step. Problem is for a lot of kids going into college, they don't know what their next step looks like.
Sure.
So it's hard to use that as guidance, but if you do know, then certainly put that kind of front line. Atmosphere matters. Like you go to a place and you can see yourself there,
Mhm.
or you go to a place and you can't see yourself there. And also you change over time. So I'm sure if I was picking colleges today, I would not have picked kind of where I ended up. It's like I remember going to see Brandeis, and I have friends who love Brandeis. But I was there like on a rainy day. It's a relatively small school over a huge campus. I was coming out of a city school where there were 4,000 kids in one building. And I remember having an interview with Brandeis and they were like, "No, we're a big school. We have almost 3,000 students." I was like, "No, you're not a big
You're
school."
not.
I was like, "I'm gonna
Oh,
fall in a ditch and like be left here. No one's going to find me for decades." Like I couldn't see myself there, knowing that even though out of my options, it might have been one of my best academic options, but I could not imagine spending 4 years there. So it's really kind of trusting, and it's also hard at that age to really trust yourself and that you have something to
mhm.
contribute to that decision versus like family legacy or, this is where the expectation is, or picking the school that's the best you can get into, which I can both like support and not support. You know what I mean? Like,
What would you say to a younger girl who is concerned that she can't be a good mom and have a successful career?
so I would say it's hard, but everything in life is hard, right? Having a successful career is hard, right? And being a good mom is hard. And therefore the balance is hard. One of my favorite talks that I do is about the myth of work-life balance because you can't have work-life balance because work is part of life and you can't balance a part against the whole. Right? So it's really about knowing what's important to you and priorities and figuring out how to make that work. And your priorities may change day to day. Like, I don't know, my kid got sick this morning, so I was at the pediatrician this morning, and then I took care of that. And now I'm here doing this because this is important for me. And it doesn't make me any less of a good mom because I left my kid at home with soup rather
Right.
than sitting there watching him eat it. He's perfectly well taken care of by his own father and will be just fine he knows that there are things that are in my life that are important to me because there will be also things in his life that are important to him that he should know how to prioritize. And I think that this is an important, when we talk to people, especially for girls, right? Like it's important for them to see you prioritize yourself, prioritize things that are
Mhm.
important to you, because at some point they will have to make that decision. And if the only thing they've ever seen is self-sacrifice, then why are we surprised that that's how they approach things? So as much as you might think that you're doing the best for them by like hovering in the background because God forbid they might need something, they never really get to see what it looks like to make a hard choice. Yeah, it's hard. My kids went to daycare really early and it was amazing. And I'm eternally grateful to the daycare that raised them. But they went at 3 months and 5 months. And I remember getting questions like, well, how could you leave your kid? And I was like, because the other things I do in my life are also important. It was really understanding what was important to me and making sure that at any given time I respect that.
Do you feel that guilt of, like you said, you've had other women mention or other people mention, how could you put your kids in daycare? Do you feel that guilt?
I think everybody feels the guilt. I don't
Yeah,
think there's a way around the guilt. I think you just kind of, and it's guilty because you're damned if you do and damned if you don't,
right,
right? Because, and you have this conversation with women all the time. You choose to stay home, and everyone looks at you like, really? What do you do all day with yourself?
right.
Right?
Yep.
And then you go to work, and we're like, really? Are you sure that you really don't want to be there for your kids? So, you kind of accept the fact that you will get judged
No
whatever
matter
it is you
what.
do. Therefore, the only person who has to live with that decision is you. And as long as you can live with that decision, then it's okay. That doesn't get you out of feeling guilty, though. Do I not feel guilty when I can't make a particular event that it was important to my kid? I do. But I also feel guilty when, I don't do my best for a client. It's just guilt is one of the emotions we feel. Sometimes I also feel sad and happy and mad and all those other things. I don't think the purpose of our lives is to avoid feeling guilty, right? And
Right.
therefore, I don't generally make decisions based on is this going to generate guilt for me or not. Also thinking ahead, like, okay, if I choose this right, doing something is not doing something else. If I choose to do this right now, is this optimal, defined in whatever general way for me to use this chunk of time? Right.
Right.
And that could be, I just want to sit and stare at a wall because I've talked to people all day long and I want to do absolutely nothing. And that may be the right decision for that half hour because that's what I need right now.
You and I had talked about, like, in your situation, you felt like you were late to get married and have children. That's a difficult period for women. And I feel like we're getting over the hump of women being included. Like, okay, women can work with men and women can be included, but we haven't really addressed well, then when do we have children? When do we, making the time to find partners? I feel like we're still working on, if a woman says, okay, for the next 5 years, I'm going to step away from my, corporate job. I might work part-time, but I don't want a big job right now. I just want to focus on having my children. And then once I feel comfortable leaving them in daycare or whatever, then I'll go back to my career. And I feel like companies in our society is still working on, like, is that okay? Like, can I put them back in the same position? And as a society, kind of, what can we do to help? Do we need to accommodate women? Do we need the more flexible schedules? Do women need to, kind of work on themselves and what they want and feeling comfortable asking for it? I hear that a lot. Like, we're not comfortable asking for our job back. Like, we demote ourselves because,
Mhm.
yeah, I was out of the workforce for 5 years. And so maybe I don't know as much as I did before. Or, when you're incredibly brilliant and you've stayed up on things and you read books and you watch the news and you can totally go back to your job and do perfectly fine. Kind of what's your opinion on that?
So I think that unfortunately there's no single answer because I think what's right for one person isn't necessarily right for the next person, right? And some people have more resources and some people want different levels of involvement, right? Some having a family means different things to different people. And and depending on how involved their spouses are or how much family support there is and how important that is to you, right? Maybe it's important for you that your kid has time with their grandparents. And if you weren't, working a crazy job, you would still have to create that time for your kid to spend with their grandparents. So I don't think there's like a societal answer. I think that what society could do for women is open the conversation and create options, right? It doesn't have to dictate options. It just has to create them, right?
Right.
And that option may apply to a lot of different situations because very similar things come up when people take care of elderly parents, right? In a lot of ways, that is no different, right? Like if you have to take your parent to, I don't know, the hospital, and then you have to be there every day to make sure that they're getting the care they need, that is really no different, except actually
Mhm.
there's less resources in place. So I think that if companies or the world can create, like, limit what you need from your employees to what you need from your employees, right? Like there's like a big
Mhm.
push for kind of coming back to the office right now. And it's really like, to what end is that, right? And it's a complicated question, but what is it taking away, right?
Right.
Or what is the best way to get work out of your employees? Like for me, I went back to the office after COVID almost immediately. My clients prefer in person. I prefer to see my clients in person. I
Right.
find that to be more effective. So I make sure I'm available to go in. But if I was, I don't know, a computer programmer, then I think I would probably be more effective if I stayed home and programmed instead of spending an
Right.
hour a day commuting. So that's what I mean. There's no single answer. Do I like I create my own schedule, so I have a lot of flexibility, but I also often work weekends and evenings, right? Because that's the price of for my flexibility. You gotta
Right.
make the hours fit somewhere. The more kind of tools in a toolbox we can create as a society, and whether that means flexibility, whether that means kind of understanding, whether that means less judgment, whether that means, more opportunities for fathers, right?
Yeah.
Because
Right.
like if I feel like if a woman comes to her boss and say, "Hey, I need to leave at 4 today because my kid gets out of school," there may actually be more understanding than if a guy came to his boss and
Right.
say, "You know what, I need to leave at 4 because I have to go get my kid." So I think that we need more understanding across the board for everybody.
Yes.
Step up everybody's involvement, but also stop pretending like we know what families need. Have giving people a chance to ask what they need. And if it's a valuable employee, then figuring out what is it that will help them. And I think about coming back to the workforce, in some ways, it's hard because even if you've kept up with your job, it's often not your job that you want because everybody else is, your cohort is 5 years older, right? Your
Yeah.
cohort is 5 years ahead. You don't necessarily want your job. You want their job. And you may
Right.
not be prepared for their job. So it's also reconciling in your own head that where you're coming back in is probably where you left, not where
Hmm.
your cohort now is. And that's the same, the inverse problem of the having a family, right? If I was going to stay in school for 5 years longer than everybody else, I was going to have to accept the fact that I was not going to be with my cohort on the kind of parenting and family life
Right.
thing. I was going to be 5 years behind. So I think those decisions kind of apply everywhere,
Right.
right? It's not just to work or to workforce, or it's everywhere. It's everything you do.
Allowing for options because everyone has a different, life situation and what they want.
For one person, it may be a flexible schedule. For another person, maybe a $20,000 bonus so they can hire a
Yeah.
nanny because
Yep.
that may be their preference.
Yep.
And why, as your employer, should I have to decide what is the right decision for you? So I think it's really like, I think you made a really good point. It's really being okay with having the conversation, figuring out what it is that works with your life and what is it that would be helpful to you.
I want to kind of wrap it up with just talking about what are you excited about in the future?
So I have all sorts of interests and all sorts of things. So and 2025 and 2026 are kind of like my big, because I spent a lot of time kind of establishing a career. And I feel like at this point, I am lucky enough to be in a place where I can already be making some choices, where I am much clearer on what I like and what I don't like, what I want to do more of, what I want to do less of. So there's a couple of things. I wrote a children's book. It's a pick your own adventure kind of about frustration tolerance, because I think we don't talk enough about frustration tolerance. That's the other thing kids these days have a
Yep.
hard time with. And it's like, work. I didn't even have to make anything up, or I named the book. The main character is named after my son. It's like true story. And it's in publication. I'm hoping it will come out sometime this year, so that will be really exciting. Called An Unfair Day. So that was a big project. And like, but again, like it was finding time to do that because that's clearly
Right.
an unpaid project, right?
Mhm.
But it was important to me and it was something I was excited about. So that happened. I'd like to do more speaking engagements because I like talking to people and I like kind of this format where it's kind of like a back and forth when I run workshops.
Right.
Of the same way, like I want to have conversations, and I think there's a lot of important conversations we're not having that mental
Mhm.
health professionals can really help people have, even if they're not explicitly about mental health. There's a lot of mental health conversations to have that aren't necessarily called, let's talk about depression or let's talk
Right.
about anxiety. I'd like to do kind of more of that and we'll invest time into that. And the last area is for the last 5, 6 years I've been with this practice. I've done a lot of divorce work, a lot of custody evals, and that world is so broken. And yet impacts so many families. And there's a new movement called collaborative divorce, where kind of people come to the table. So you get each spouse gets an attorney who's collaboratively trained, and they build a team. So there's a mental health professional and usually a financial neutral, and you come to the table as a team and you identify the couple's goals and you help them get to their goals. Nothing is filed with the court until an agreement is reached. You get to help people create a life they want out of a really difficult situation.
Yeah.
And that work is really rewarding. And we can work through some really hard issues. It's
Yeah.
especially good for people with mental health concerns because it's non-punitive. Because if you go like, or people who have
Right.
addiction histories, right? If you go into a courtroom with an addiction history, it will certainly be held against you. Versus if that is not what the spouses want and you just need to put in support so that this parent can parent at their best, then we can do that. And kind of save this family a whole lot of heartache. One of my 2025 goals is to do a lot more kind of education of the public, education of other professionals who hear of people who are getting divorced, like clergy and mental health professionals, and so that people can really know what resources are at their fingertips.